Hi, I'm Kevin Hildebrand, and in this video I would like to talk about leading new hymns in liturgy. Our goal as church organists is to lead the singing of the congregation. And sometimes we're presented with a new or less familiar hymn or liturgical setting. It could be something that is very new, very recently written, or it could actually be something very old but still not familiar to us. When we're talking about new hymns in liturgy, what we really mean are things that are new to us or new to our congregation. And our goal is, how can we make those more familiar to the singers and more familiar to us as organists to help lead that music and lead that singing? Let me share some ideas. The first idea I would like to talk about really takes place apart from sitting down at the console and really several weeks in advance. Think about ways to begin to teach this new hymn or liturgical setting to a choir, school, Sunday school, other church group within the congregation, so that several weeks before we use this new hymn or liturgical setting, there's some part of the church already hearing it, already practicing it. Have them practice singing it. Perhaps the choir may even use it as some service music in preceding weeks prior to when we want to use this hymn or music in the church service. The purpose of that is the first time we use this new hymn or liturgical setting on Sunday morning, it isn't entirely cold to everyone in the building. Some people have already heard it or practiced it or tried it out already. It is also especially helpful to have a choir or soloist lead that new hymn or liturgical setting on that Sunday. Perhaps having the choir or soloist sing one or more stanzas of a hymn by themselves will help model that new melody to the congregation. Now, when it comes down to specific ideas for playing a new hymn or a new piece of music, there are some things that we as organists can do to help that. We'll want to solo out that melody, meaning we'll play the soprano, the melody, with our right hand on one manual, probably with a very prominent registration like a solo trumpet. And then with our left hand, we'll play our tenor and alto together. And of course, we'll play the bass line with our feet. It's a new experience to play and read tenor and alto together with our left hand on one manual while playing the melody with another hand on the other manual. But with some practice, that can be a very useful tool to help solo out and make that melody very prominent. For an example of this, let's look at hymn 836 in Lutheran Service Book, O God of Light. I think especially line 3 of this hymn is a good place to solo out the melody, where there's some larger and less familiar intervals for the singers to maneuver. And if we would play the melody on a clear registration on one manual, and then our alto and tenor down here, and our bass and our feet, we can help lead that melody. Something like this. Now, of course, if that technique isn't comfortable for you yet, you can still find ways to highlight that melody, and the simplest way is to play the melody only in octaves in both hands, and perhaps even in the pedal. We could play the whole hymn that way as the congregation is beginning to learn it. For instance, we would start the hymn in this way. want to put all four parts in at the cadence of the hymn to give us a more clear conclusion to that musical phrase. But then going back to playing melody in octaves in the manuals, and again, perhaps in the pedals, especially in that third line. One important thing in our planning and in our playing is anticipating passages where it may be especially helpful to highlight the melody in a clear way. For instance, at one line of this particular hymn. Let's look at another hymn, 505 in Lutheran Service Book, Triune God, Be Thou Our Stay. This is actually a very old hymn, a hymn of Martin Luther, but it may be less familiar to some congregations and to some organists. One of the benefits of this hymn is that it has a lot of repetition in its musical construction. For instance, the first and second phrases of the hymn are identical musically. So one technique we could use is to play the first phrase in unison octaves, and then play the second phrase in the harmonization according to the hymnal, like this. Because of the repeating musical phrases in this hymn, it may be helpful to continue that pattern throughout the hymn, playing one phrase in octaves and then its repeating phrase with the four-part harmonization. As we also anticipate places where it may be helpful to highlight the melody, we see an example in that in the fourth phrase of the hymn, and let us trust thee solely. That would be a good place to play in octaves if the congregation is just learning those intervals. Let's look at another hymn, 529, Since Our Great High Priest, Christ Jesus. Like the previous hymn, there's some musical similarities as we go phrase by phrase. The first and second phrase have very identical material. So we could play the first phrase in octaves to highlight that melody, and then perhaps play the second phrase according to the harmonization given in the hymnal, since that's our second time hearing that melody, like this. Then the second phrase in parts. The third phrase of the hymn is some new musical material, and it starts out and sings in a higher range than the congregation may anticipate, so having a clear, full, bold registration would be helpful here. Also, perhaps begin the third phrase by playing in octaves, and maybe completing the hymn by going back to the four-part harmonization at the cadence, like this. Speaking of registration, we can make some registration choices that make new hymns and liturgy even more helpful. Make sure we have something clear and bright, but not too bright. Perhaps avoid or reduce the use of mixtures. Mixtures are the bright crown on top of a principal chorus. And in our video about organ registration, we talked quite a bit about making choices with mixtures and other stops. Because of their high pitches, mixtures might obscure a melody that is less familiar to a congregation. Use your ears and see what your ears tell you with the instrument in your church. And if you can get away with using a mixture, that's fine, or you may want to avoid the use of the mixture in order to highlight and make clear that melody. Also, you may want to enlist the use of instrumentalists to help play the melody along with the organ and with the singing in order to clearly state that new melody. And finally, it may be helpful to use choir or soloists to help lead that singing of that new hymn or liturgical material, especially having the choir or vocalist sing one or more stanzas by themselves in order to model that new melody to the congregation. Now let's talk about some specific things within some of the liturgical settings in Lutheran service book that may be less familiar to your congregation. First, let's consider Divine Service Setting 4. This liturgical setting is based almost entirely on hymn tunes. We can find correlations to those hymn tunes elsewhere in the book. For instance, the Sanctus is the same as Thine the Amen, Thine the Praise. The Agnus Dei in Divine Service Setting 4 is the same tune as 3 hymns elsewhere in the hymnal. And the Nunc Dimittis is the same as the hymn tune for all the faithful women. Finding ways to introduce and learn those hymns prior to learning or using that Divine Service Setting 4 could be a way to reinforce those tunes and make the use of that service setting more useful to your congregation. One other new setting in Lutheran Service Book is the service of prayer and preaching. The musical requirements are limited in this service. There are 2 canticles, the Old Testament and New Testament canticles. It may be helpful as a congregation is being introduced to this service to have a choir or vocalist sing those canticles exclusively for several weeks so that the congregation can hear them. The next step may be to have the congregation sing the refrain only and then have a choir or soloist sing the verses by themselves. Finally, after a series of several weeks of practice and rehearsal, the congregation may be ready to sing the entire canticle. A final thought, in whatever kind of new hymns or liturgy that we may be trying, is to find ways in future weeks to reuse that same hymn or musical material so that we have ways to rehear and relearn that in the congregation. I hope those ideas are helpful for you as the church organist as well. Be sure to look at our other videos with more ideas for hymn and liturgy playing. And thank you for watching.